the Triathlon Show 350. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and apologies if you can hear from my voice that I'm not at 100% health. I've been putting off recording this intro for more than a week now, and I'm getting to my deadline to get it done, but I'm still not quite healthy, just a bit of a bug that I caught, and you can hear it probably, but I just have to get this one done now in any way that I can. Apologies for that, and hope I will feel better soon. On today's episode, I interview Tim Reid, who is an Australian coach and professional triathlete who has an Ironman 70.3 World Championship title from 2016 to his name, along with multiple Ironman and Ironman 70.3 victories. And as a coach, he coaches both age group and professional athletes, with Sam Appleton being one of the well-recognized pros that he's working with. And in today's interview, we dive deep into Tim's perspectives on training and coaching, as well as on racing and how to perform the best when it matters the most on race day. But before that, we have to thank our sponsors, and also I have a few Scientific Triathlon related announcements that I'll go through first. So if you have zero interest in sponsors or announcement, I recommend that you skip ahead a couple of minutes at this point. But I'll try to be quick and concise. First, our Mallorca training camp for 2023 is now officially open for registration. The dates will be the 25th of March to the 1st of April of 2023. You can read more on scientifictriathlon.com, and you can also register there on that training camp page. And I really hope to see you in Mallorca. We had a fantastic week this year on our inaugural camp, and I'm confident that it will be even better next year. The second announcement is that I finally finished the advanced sprint distance training plan that I've been working on for a long time. And as normal, if you've been following along for a while, I always want to give a special opportunity for early adopters of any of my new training plans. So until the 14th of August, which is this coming Sunday, if you listen the week of this episode's release, you can get 60% off from the regular price of the plan before the price returns to normal. So the easiest way to do this is to simply go to scientifictriathlon.com, go to the training plans page, and there you'll find the links and discount codes that you need to purchase the plan for 60% off. And finally, this is not a new announcement. I have talked about this before, but I just want to remind everybody that we are also running a camp in Portugal in January. And Mallorca is our flagship event with a lot of athletes of many different abilities, whereas Portugal will be a smaller camp for a small group of athletes of a fairly similar level and a fairly advanced level. So we do have a handful of slots left for this camp. So check out the details on scientifictriathlon.com and email me with any questions about any of the above. And if you're interested to learn more or register, I will be happy to help you out. Now, big thanks to Precision Fuel and Hydration that create sports nutrition products and hydration products, and they help you use these products effectively through a range of free tools, services, and content. They have created a fantastic fuel and hydration planner that you can use. It's on their website, and it's a one-stop shop for figuring out an effective race hydration and fueling strategy for you. It's free and super easy to use. It only takes a couple of minutes to answer a handful of questions, and then you get a detailed, simple, and effective race plan. They also have free video consultations, and as a listener of the podcast, you can get 15% off your order of the range of electrolyte and carbohydrate products by using the code TTS22 at checkout on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Roka. Roka produce exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, and prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. Roka started as a wetsuit company, and that is one of their most important products still to this date. They have a fantastic range of options, from the entry-level Maverick that is still extremely high quality, all the way up to the flagship model, the Maverick X2. All of Roka's wetsuits come with the patented arms-up technology, which maximizes shoulder mobility. And then depending on which model you choose, there's a ton of other amazing features and technology that has gone into the development of these. So by all means, go to roka.com to read all about the models and figure out which one is the best for you. And if you want to order, make sure to go to roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. Now, without any further ado, here's my interview with Tim Reid. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Tim. How are you doing?
I'm really good. Thank you for having me on. I know it's been a long time coming, but I appreciate your patience with waiting for me to find some time.
Yeah, well, actually, it's we're managing to do it now that you're also based in Europe, which makes time scheduling a bit easier rather than being in Australia. So, which brings us to, I guess, can you introduce yourself a bit more for people that may not know you, and tell us who you are and what your background in the sport is.
Yeah, so my name is Tim Reid. I started off in the sport, I guess, as an age grouper, soon after finishing school, and did that for 5 or 6 years before turning professional, and then a 1 year sabbatical from work to race as a pro turned into 11 years now as a professional, and still racing as a pro, but sort of also spending a lot more of my time coaching and putting back into the other athletes, and I guess starting the transition into life after racing.
Yeah. Do you see yourself doing that, both of those in parallel, the racing and the coaching, for a couple more years or so? Or do you have what are your plans in that regard?
I'm not sure. I thought at the end of last year I was really suffering some real chronic fatigue symptoms, and I went from, I had a couple of podiums and a second at Australian champs early in the year, and then I almost couldn't get out of my way for a block of racing in the US, and sort of finished the year very depressed about racing, thinking, all right, that's me done. But, I feel then my sort of health got better, and I took a very long break, and I really missed training and just being healthy and racing. And I thought, well, even if I only train up properly for a few races each year, it's still something that excites me. And I think I need to, I sort of need it for my personality. So I don't know how many more years, but certainly while I've still got some sponsors, I'll do the best I can for several races each year, and then try and create value outside of racing in other ways, I guess.
Yeah. And as listeners on the show are familiar with, we will talk mostly training, coaching, that sort of thing, and not so much your racing history. But you have been on plenty of other podcasts discussing that, so I can put some links in the show notes for people that want to hear more about you as an athlete. But today we'll focus a bit more on the coaching side, even though, of course, that will be influenced by your experiences as an athlete, as it should. But if we start with that training discussion and coaching discussion, how would you describe your approach to triathlon training?
Yeah, I think it's mentioning my racing experience, I think it's a real mixture of science and racing experience, but also I've always felt like one of my strengths is getting on with people and understanding people, and realizing that there's a big, regardless of the scientific principles or the training principles, that the athlete's personality can have a big influence in what they need and how they approach the sport, their recovery, what sort of mental approach you need to take with them to get the most out of them. I think I like to combine a bit of everything with my approach, and certainly it's been a very didactic journey, and I'm still learning every day with coaching, and sort of trying never to become closed-minded with the approach, because as much as we think sports science is settled, I think you can see every few years there's quite a big switch with different approaches and different nutrition, sports nutrition approaches and training approaches, and I feel like it's a constant journey, and I'm definitely along for the ride and trying to keep an open mind the whole way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned getting along with people and how people's personalities being a big influence in how they respond to training. I think that's when we think about the science of endurance sports, we often think about just the sports science aspect, but we forget about things like psychology and behavioral science, and there's a whole bunch of other things. And of course, it's not just about the science, but we sometimes think about those as soft skills, but there are also scientific there are scientific findings in those fields if you go out and look for them. So it's not just woo woo in that regard either. It makes complete sense that different personalities will react different to different approaches, and you need to take that into account, whether it's more of an experience-based approach or not. But if we go to the different disciplines and discuss some, maybe you can give some key principles of how you would help an athlete improve in each of them. So if you start with swimming, what are a couple of key tips you would give for an athlete that wants to improve their swimming?
Yeah, I think swimming is a really interesting one because even though we know that the sort of the basic principle of predominantly aerobic work to anaerobic works for endurance sports, I think a lot of athletes just jump into squads and they're doing way too much anaerobic swimming. And the downside to that, apart from just the physiological stress of turning up each day and smashing yourself, is they start to practice poor form in the water. And we know how important just making good technique autonomous is. And so one of the main things I work on with athletes, especially if I can see that they're not holding relatively good technique in the water, is actually getting them out of swim squads, especially if they can't control themselves or drop down a lane and have a little bit of swallow their pride a little bit, is bringing in a lot more aerobic training into the swim and treating it almost like I would treat the bike and run, and pretty much only having, 1 to 2 really hard swims a week, and the rest is sort of in that very aerobic zone 2 range and working within that range to try and build the efficiency at a cellular level, but also just building efficiency with their technique, because I've seen it a lot, and I've been part of squads where I myself and many other athletes are just smoking yourself trying to keep up with a 3Ks of threshold or 2Ks of threshold, and you get into a race and you're swimming worse than ever. So I've seen some great improvement, especially with the third tier, second tier, and third tier pros that I take on, which are sort of the professionals I prefer to take on anyway, because I feel like there's a lot more to gain rather than someone who's already going really well. I've seen big changes in their swimming actually through pulling them back from doing too much anaerobic swimming. So that would, I guess that would sum up my swim approach. I get a lot of guys to do less squad swimming if they can't, unless the squads run really well, where they do really take a polarized approach to their training.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. And I literally last week I talked to a couple of athletes about that and said the exact thing that you just said, that I tried to explain my approach to swim training, because I explaining why it's different to what they might be used to from swim squads, and said that, I treat it more like the bike and the run, like you just said. And I agree with all of those things that you said, and have experienced that myself as well. And it's one thing to have 3Ks of threshold swimming. That's actually not that bad, but the thing is, it's never threshold, is it? It's an all out. How fast can you go for the set when you're doing it in that environment normally? Yeah,
and also if they're doing it too often, they just sort of end up grey zone swimming too. If it's every day,
Oh yeah,
there's no real. You can get to the point where you're so tired that they don't even swim threshold. It's just a sort of that zone 3 range, and which has its place, but I still think the zone 2 in the water is super, super important.
Yeah, and that's where even squads that are well run and have a strong endurance component, the pace there is often dictated by the fastest swimmer of the lane, and that might not be appropriate for. And it's so easy to you do get sucked into, even with the best intentions, you get sucked into that same pace and thinking that, actually my endurance pace is, I'm going really well right now, but in reality, you might just be pushing it a bit harder than you should.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
All right. Well, what about biking?
Yeah, cycling's complicated because it's such a strength endurance-based sport. And so you have some athletes who have a huge aerobic history and still aren't riding well. And you sort of have to look at it and go, well, what's holding them back here? Is it their aerobic efficiency, or is it their straight-up strength endurance? And so there's certainly with athletes who are newer to the sport, who don't have that aerobic history, the very traditional approach of a lot of aerobic training, and then, sprinkling in the higher intensity work is, for the first 5 to 6 years of an athlete's I guess, training career or training life, I think that's super important. But when you get those athletes who just aren't putting it together, who have a huge aerobic history, I take a more of a strength endurance approach. Sometimes a lot more gym work to try and build up the straight up raw strength and power. So yeah, it's an individual approach. I don't think there's one approach with cycling that will get improvements. I think you've really got to look at, okay, what's an athlete's weakness on the bike and what's holding them back. So even, throughout my own career as an age grouper, I think I was lucky to have a coach who was just very volume based. And then when I switched to someone like Matt Dixon, who was very much about strength endurance and key intervals, I felt like the two combined to help me have a few really good years there on the bike. And so I try and take that on and use that and try not to come to an athlete, try not to approach the coaching on the bike with a real one size fits all approach. Really try and work out what's lacking with the athlete.
In those scenarios, if you come to the conclusion that an athlete is in need of that type of strength endurance work, can you give some examples of what sort of sessions you would give to get to that issue?
So yes, straight up, just gym work is important. I think, it's important across the board for preventing injuries and staying consistent, but I think you do start to see some really big improvements on the bike too, and it's so time efficient. And then of course there's the classic strength endurance sessions, just heading out for 5 times 8 minute hill reps at lower cadence, and then you can go even quite a lot shorter and bring the power up even further. I think the one thing I'm pretty strong on with those longer strength endurance intervals is it doesn't have to be super high intensity. When I watch someone doing a strength endurance interval and their spine is bent and they're favoring one leg and all that sort of thing, I would rather they held TT position, even if it's a flat strength endurance interval, so they can do that. And are using their core, actually getting their glutes to fire properly. So I think form and strength endurance together can help to create a strong athlete. But yeah, interestingly, the science is pretty mixed on it. When you look at, like most sports science, it's pretty limited studies and I think they're very much cycling based. But for me, those longer strength endurance intervals ranging from, 50 RPM to 70 RPM work, sustained intervals from up to 20-minute intervals, but not super hard. I find for a lot of athletes who are just don't quite have that muscular resilience to get off and run well, even if they're biking well, I feel like you can get some really great improvements.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. The science is mixed, but I think that we have to consider what is the outcome that we're training for. And as you say, running off the bike, that's not what's tested. That's not the outcome measure. It's improvement in VO2 max, or maybe improvement in threshold, or lactate at 4 millimoles. Those are typical measures that we see. Even time trial performance sometimes, which is a more relevant outcome metric, but even then, again, that's not necessarily what's holding us back. It's more about how well can we run off that bike, and that's one of the main things that I guess you're really wanting to address with the strength endurance when it comes to long distance triathlon in particular.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point in general. With a lot of the science that we try to implement or trying to carry across into triathlon, is so much of the research around fueling, around the types of different training is often based around what improved a 40K time trial, or what improved a 5K run. You even look at like the effects of altitude training, and so you always have to take it a little bit carefully and realize, okay, it's very hard to do a controlled study on, an 8-hour race or a 4-hour race. So the science is there, but I think it's you look at it, you can try and emulate it and see what effect it gives, but realize that it's very hard to get proper controlled studies looking at the effect on triathlon performance.
Yeah. And moving on to running then, what would we say are the key tips that you would give there?
Yeah, so I don't like to be too volume-based on the bike, but I do think volume is important on the run in terms of, people could be doing, to compare the two, people could say, oh, I've been riding 800 kilometers a week. And in my mind, that doesn't really mean anything, because, you could be sitting behind a motorbike for a 200K ride and it takes you 3 hours, or you could be sitting in a peloton, in zone 1, ticking along at 40 kilometers an hour. Whereas on the run, I feel like this might be a bit controversial, but I don't feel like there's never junk mileage, in that there's always a stress on the body, no matter what pace you're going. It has to all be factored in, and it's not the worst measure of the load that you're doing. So even if a great runner is doing an easy run at 5.5 minute kilometer pace, it's still, every time their foot hits the ground, it's still their full body weight going through the leg. And so I keep an eye on volume for sure, and certainly trying to get volume up to a point where it doesn't affect the cycling and swimming, and is absorbable and showing benefits is a pretty big part of how I would coach an athlete. And I think the other approach I take with it is to steer clear of chronic volume with my triathletes. So we might do a 5 to 10 day running block, but then we might back off for quite a bit and bring back the cycling. I find, there's no doubt, especially with pros, if you can get up to that 90, 100 kilometer a week run volume, it's great. But I find if you start doing it week in, week out, the cycling, you see the cycling really drop off. They start to sit too low in the water and in the swim. So I try to steer clear of, a chronic style of run volume, but it is an important part of the training, and having little blocks of high volume running, I think, really works. But of course, again, that's very individual. I have some pros who just can't get over 80 kilometers a week without getting injured, and then some pros who are just bulletproof, and you can throw a lot of run mileage at them, and they continue to improve. So I don't know how specific.
And 80 is quite a lot. You would see a lot of pros that are doing significantly less than that, at least if you look at it in terms of a quarterly average or something like that. It might be more 50K or 60K or even 40K in some cases.
100%. I mean, I say weekly mileage looking at their bigger weeks. I probably if you averaged it out, it would be a lot lower for many athletes, and some athletes, I mean, depending on what they're good at too. If they've got if they're hugely aerobically efficient, then you might be working more at higher intensity, closer to higher lactate levels, to sort of you can get that impact through the legs through faster running. And if they're not super aerobically efficient, then sometimes you got to go the mileage route and really build up their sub-threshold efficiency.
And what would that potentially look like? Just easy to steady running, or would you do some threshold running in that case, or what would that look like?
I think I still like to include probably all intensities in the week, but it might just be, it's the proportion that would change a lot. But predominantly for those that need to improve that sub-threshold efficiency, it's just aerobic mileage, quite comfortable. Typically because people tend to get less injured with that, but then certainly there's some athletes. I've got one pro who he actually seems to get injured more when he's running slow. He's not the most balanced biomechanically, but when he's running quicker, it's almost like there's the leg length difference and the issues he have have less of an impact. So it's a tricky one, but I think similar to the cycling, it's working out what's the primary limiter, and then building the run training around that. And interestingly, especially now, I'm realizing more and more as I start to get more into testing is how much that can change after a year or two. So what someone needed 2 years ago could be very different to where they're at now. So it's a sort of dynamic planning, I guess, and not being too stuck on this athlete responds well to this, therefore they must always have this. It's where are they at now? What's their weakness? What do we need to do for this time? And then we'll retest and go again in 6 months' time and see if we need to change that stimulus.
Yeah. One more question on running, and then I want to follow up on that, on testing in general, not just in running. But when When you prescribe the sort of the easy aerobic running, how particular are you about it being, for example, very easy or just comfortable? Is the athlete able to choose themselves what feels comfortable for them, or do you have specific pace or heart rate targets? And are you somebody that favors more really keeping the easy running really easy, or are you okay with it being more kind of steady zone 2 rather than zone 1?
Yeah, it's it's sort of individual, but I find it interesting how much people talk about, I do the 80-20 approach. I'm like, yeah, but within that 80, someone running at low zone 2 compared to high zone 2 can be a massive difference. And so I do a lot of different sessions within that zone 2 range, so that a lot of getting to the top of zone 2, working at aerobic threshold, particularly for those athletes that have, that are quite efficient at the lower intensities. Their propensity for injury plays a big role. So it would depend also on how much time they've got. If an athlete doesn't have time to go for a 2.5 hour super easy trail run, then and they've only got an hour and a half on a Sunday, then we would spend a fair bit more time, maybe including 2 times 20 minutes within that block at the top of zone 2. So yeah, it would depend basically is the short answer, but
I guess you do look specifically at where you are, and that depends on the athletes, but it's not just about easy running, and then it can be anywhere from 5:30 to 4 minutes flat. It's more specific than that.
100%. So it's very rare that I would say just go for a zone 2 run. It'll be, hey, we need this one at low zone 2, mid zone 2, or high zone 2. Or there is occasions where, especially if I can't see an athlete regularly, I'll basically give them options based off their HRV and sleep data. So I'll be like, okay, this is the long run. If your HRV is high, your resting heart rate's low, then let's include the last 30 minutes at the top of zone 2. And if you wake up and you're tired, exhausted, let's just stick to low zone 2 and focus on just keeping it relatively low stress.
Right. Yeah. So then if we go to testing, which you mentioned there, and you said that you're getting into it more now. So can you tell us about that? What kind of testing are you doing in the different disciplines, and how do you use that? Yeah,
it was hard up until this year, really, because I was so focused on my own training. So, but I also limited the number of athletes I coached, but certainly doing a lot more lactate testing now. I've always looked at measuring ketones and things just to see, not necessarily chasing, full-blown ketosis or anything like that, but certainly for athletes that seemed very carb dependent or needed to improve their metabolic efficiency a little bit, just working on, for those that are time crunched, maybe doing slightly lower carb sessions for shorter durations when they don't have the time to head out for the 5 or 6 hour rides that the pro athletes do. A lot of sub-threshold testing, it's always hard because it's hard to control all the variables, and certainly in the next year or two I want to have a bit more of a lab set up back home so that I can do better testing. But I think just getting people to start to check in more on VO2 max testing is important. I guess they're the main tests I look at, but the biggest test that I like and is actually getting people to race and just looking through the data and finding out, okay, where did we fall flat here? Was hydration adequate? Was your fueling adequate? And then if those two are fine, then let's look at what training stimulus we need to move to, because you can get a lot out of just looking at races and working out, okay, where do we fall short here?
Yeah. And strength training, you mentioned already that as something that can be really important for the cycling part. But can you give us any other tips on strength training, or tell us about how you use strength training?
Yeah, I think especially in the last few years, I think 2019 before COVID, I had some of my best races, but I was also had 3 kids and a working wife, and so I think for time efficiency, to get the conditioning in your legs that you need for Ironman, one of the biggest things that holds people back is muscle breakdown. I found the strength training hugely important from a straight up performance perspective and getting that muscular resilience. But, on the, for me, we always say, with my coaching partner and I, that's consistency over craziness. And the best way to be consistent is to stay injury free year after year. And I don't think you can argue against the ability of strength training to prevent injuries longer term. It can be very hard for people, especially in that first 4 to 6 weeks where, they're getting sore from the strength work. It's affecting their sessions. And they, on a short-term level, they might actually go backwards with some of their training because they're sort of adding in another quite significant stress. But longer term, I think if you can stay consistent with it and you get to the point where it's actually quite hard to get really sore from the strength work, but, you're getting mild soreness, I think it can really pay off longer term in preventing injuries. So certainly outside of the race-specific phases, we have all our athletes doing at least, they're not even long sessions, 2 times 20-minute strength sessions a week. And often just 2 or 3 little exercises before a long run or after a long run or even a bike, just to realign and get things firing well is really a big part of the program. And then, in the off season, up to 3 sessions a week, especially for the athletes that really need it. So that's sort of the approach I take. And I know it's, there's certain coaches out there who think you can get all the strength work out of certain sessions. I don't necessarily agree with that. And I think that for long-term development and staying injury-free, I think strength training is crucial.
Yeah, so certainly on the bike, it's a big difference to just turn the cranks over compared to actually lifting some weights when you do the math on the newtons that you're actually producing. But you mentioned there 2 times 20 minutes. That sounds almost like, is that something that the athletes can do at home? So home-based strength training, or do you still need access to a gym for that?
No, we get athletes to get some basic equipment and try and get them to do it from home. I mean, as you know, triathlon can get pretty expensive. So if you're adding in a gym membership for only 40 minutes of strength work a week, it seems a bit pointless. So I also think if you make it as easy as possible for athletes to include it, then that helps. Of course, some people, this is where the psychology comes in too. Some athletes, that you need to send them to a gym to get the work done because they need to be in that environment of people grunting and lifting to get motivated to do it. But I'd say the vast majority of our athletes just have some basic gear at home, a couple of kettlebells, a Bosu ball, a Swiss ball, and that's really, all that you need. I mean, a lot of it is just that neuromuscular connections and the activations to sort of fire well. You see it even with people doing a set of squats. When they come in and they're fatigued from all the training, you can see one glute firing, a few minutes, like a fair bit faster than the other one. By the time they've finished the 4 sets of 8, you can see that both glutes are sort of almost firing simultaneously. So it can sort of correct the activation as much as anything.
Yeah. So what kind of sets and or reps and weights are you doing? Is it are you working more on high reps, lower weights? Given that if it's home based, you can't really have most people can't have a squat rack at home, even though some people do. Or do you manage to get to be creative with exercises and still do some relatively high weights with lower reps?
Yeah, I think the science would, in my mind, at least from what I've seen, sort of supports low reps, high weight, which, like you said, is pretty hard doing it at home. So with a lot of the core work, we still go higher reps. But with things like, the basic, whether it's single leg squats or Bulgarian split squats and things like that, I don't go too high reps. I'm more about perfect form, even if the load is not that high. Because like I said, I think a lot of the advantage is actually through the connections between the brain and the muscles and getting the body firing really well. But certainly for the more elite athletes, that's where we'll get them into the gym and do some pretty high load, low rep strength intervals, strength sessions. So that's where it would mainly head. But when it comes to closer to races, the load comes right down, and I'm just all about form and little, enough strength that there's maintenance there, but we don't target any soreness, from a couple of weeks out.
Yeah. Moving on then, another training question: how do you view periodization in the yearly periodization for a long distance triathlete?
Yeah, it's super hard for pros, especially the Australians, because they end up racing all the year round. I think it's often to our detriment, but we can't say no. I think I'm a big fan still of the real traditional periodization approach, especially for athletes who are injury prone, or they start in their first 5 to 7 years of racing. I just think it makes sense to keep people injury free and building up consistency. I'm also not set that that's the only way to do well in races. Like, I've been playing around a little bit this year with reverse periodization, mainly on myself, but I could see how that could work with an athlete who's already got a huge aerobic base, and their aerobic efficiency comes up to scratch with very quickly because of that. You've got all the cellular and metabolic changes pretty much intact from 10 years of training. Do you really need to do 3 months of base work? So I'm not 100% sure on different types of periodization, but I still think for the bulk of athletes, there's a lot to be said for that traditional approach.
Yeah. And what would you say about age groupers? I don't actually know. How do you coach mostly pros or age groupers, or is it a bit of a mix?
I really limit my number of pros because, I think I get quite stressed and want to do a really good job with them, when it's their livelihood. So, no, it's predominantly age groupers, and I think the traditional periodization is the most relevant for them.
Yep. And another question relating to age groupers is: do you have any thoughts around really time crunched athletes that are training on, let's say, 10 hours or less per week, but still want to do reasonably well?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually think I enjoy coaching those athletes the most. There's plenty of little hacks along the way. There's there's never a full replacement for the athlete who has all the time in the world to do the training. So it's not to say it's, it's certainly not optimal, because there's no doubt that just big aerobic volume tends to work. But for those that are 10 hours or less, I think that's where you can really play around with different fuel sources and try and stimulate the same metabolic benefits that you would get from a 6-hour ride, just fueling as normal, to potentially a lower carb, higher fat ride, that might be 2.5 hours instead. There's then using things like heat stress to is a typical way. I guess you're trying to maximize benefits from very shorter duration sessions. We talked about that zone 2 training, and I think with athletes who are 10 hours or less, especially on the bike and in the swim, we'll do a lot more work at sort of aerobic threshold instead of that low zone 2. It's just you just don't have time to get the longer benefits of that low zone 2. That's just, if they've only got an hour to train, I feel like that low zone 2 week, you need to be 90 minutes plus to really start ticking into the benefits of it. So yeah, we work a little bit higher intensity within the zone 2 range for sure. The strength training becomes very important, because if they don't have time to do the run volume, we've got to try and create those micro tears in the legs from strength training, so that they still have the resilience off the bike and later in the run to run well. So I guess definitely using a lot more hacks, and I wouldn't call them shortcuts, but just trying different approaches to try and stimulate what you would get from a 4 to 5 hour training day into 2 hours or 90 minutes. You've got to try some different things and be a lot more creative.
Yeah. When you do those kinds of the fueling changes to training, so training on low carbs or no carbs, perhaps, can you describe some specifics around that? Do you also do them fasted and with very limited or no carbs, and how often would you do that in a week, let's say?
Yeah, again, like typically try and get some metabolic testing done with these athletes. And if they are very carb dependent, I typically wouldn't push someone into a low carb session for more than 2 hours. But if it's up to 90 minutes, 2 hours, I think there can be a lot of benefit in the body sort of not having too much, not having just sugar piling into the bloodstream. So there's the process of mobilizing fat is sort of a little bit stronger and or a lot stronger. So that would be a typical approach. If an athlete's hungry, I don't like athletes waking up and if they're starving, not eating. You don't want to. There's a level of stress you don't want to go to. I mean, we're not looking to do anything too extreme, But I always say, okay, let's go for more of a protein fat dominant breakfast instead of instead of eating your oats or whatever you might have as that approach. But at the same time, if it's a high intensity session and we're relying on glycolysis as the main process for fueling the intervals, I certainly wouldn't do that in a low carb state. So I guess it's something that keeps evolving as I learn more and the science keeps changing. I think it's a hard one to really know that you're 100% correct on, because there's so many different opinions out there. And but I think based on I sort of look at it, what does the session mainly require and what are we trying to achieve? And if it's metabolic benefits and getting better at burning fat for fuel, or even if it's just potentially for weight loss for athletes that are more in it for health and fitness, then we might go a lot more lower carb, obviously easier intensity sessions. And then if the session's target is, more around tolerating lactate or clearing, higher intensity anaerobic intervals, or even just close to sub-threshold intervals, we will include a lot more carbs and teach the body to utilize that.
Yeah, no, that's all good. And one other general question about training is, or what are some, and this could be age groupers or pros, whatever you feel is relevant and on your mind. Are there any common mistakes that you see around when you work with athletes, or just in general, social media in general, that you would warn against?
I think the number one mistake that certainly I've done, and I see many others do, is they compare their training with everyone else's. And, this guy's doing X number of hours, or this much TSS. And it's really just not comparable because, for example, especially everyone now is obsessed with what the Norwegians are doing, Gustav and Blumenfeld. And, especially one of my pros keeps talking about it. I'm like, you have a child, you're working part-time, your ability to recover. And I'm all about do as much as you can as long as the benefits keep coming and you can recover from it. But if you have a very different outside training environment, you're not finishing the session and getting fed and a massage and then going to sleep. You can't compare. It's just not. There's no point trying to target 30+ hour training weeks. So the comparisons against each other, I think it's not even more than just in training. I think it's a good lesson for life. If you start flicking through Instagram all the time, you feel pretty miserable because you're seeing everyone's perfect world. And the same goes for training. I actually stopped, once I had my third child and life was just crazy. And my wife went back to full-time work, and I was like, okay, I got to stop following all these pros who don't have a life like me, because it's ruining my enjoyment of the sport. Instead of just looking at what I can do to get better, I'm constantly comparing with their professional existence of eat, sleep, train, which, I certainly had a few years of that, so I can't complain. But the comparison does nothing for you, and I think it's something that athletes need to be very careful of.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And is there anything that you've changed your mind about in regard to training in the last few years, and that you view differently now than you used to?
Yeah, I mean, the diet one is huge. I've gone through the whole spectrum of I tend to take things to the extreme, no matter whatever I'm doing. So, and I've been through that real high carb phase, then super low carb, and now obviously I've landed somewhere in the middle. With a lot of what I've become, I used to have quite extreme opinions on. I've now realizing the answers tend to lie in the middle when you've got certain scientists, really spouting one direction on things, and then the others the total opposite. I guess I'm learning to just look for the answer somewhere in the middle. It is changing a lot, and I think I've even 5-6 years ago, I used to think this is the approach that needs to be taken for an athlete to do well, and now I'm learning, no, that's the approach for that particular athlete because of where they're at, and learning to just really have a different approach for different athletes is, every coach talks about it. Oh, we personalize based off where an athlete's at. But when I look at people's training in the groups, and I don't think many coaches actually do that as much as they say. So trying to do that is something that has become super important to me.
Yeah. Now, I would like to discuss racing a bit more, and that's something that is always fun to hear, especially from somebody with your racing experience. So, the first question I have on the topic of racing is how would you approach race selection, and in particular, this might be mostly relevant to pros that are trying to make a living off of racing, but also in some cases for age groupers, if for example, your aim is to qualify for a championship event, and then race selection might play a big part in that. So what are some tips you would give for race selection?
Yeah, I think a lot of my failures have influenced how I feel about it. So with a few of my pros who I think have a real ability to do well in the biggest races, I sort of say to them, I remind them, okay, what's the number one goals for the year? And then we have to, with so many racing options available, we just have to focus on that and accept that some races you just cannot be at your best or even close to your best. So, a classic example, and I don't think they'll mind me using this, is, Sam Appleton was, his goal this year was to do well in Kona. And, with the PTO race yesterday, we knew after Cairns he sort of rushed back into training, which is very rare for Sam, but he sort of ignored a little bit of what I was encouraging and added in a lot more sessions. And then classic post Ironman fatigue set in. He's been really struggling since. So, but we had to say going into the PTO race, it was be realistic and know that he wasn't at his best because he's still recovering from an Ironman, and we need him to actually lose a bit of fitness after that race and fully freshen up, especially, hormonally and get ready for another big block before Kona. So prioritizing what races are the most important is something that we do, and then we work back from there. And sometimes using, with so many race options, sometimes realizing a race can just be for training or for or just because it's just a payday, but you're not going to be at your best. The other thing is, I guess, the personality type. Some races, some athletes just find racing incredibly emotionally draining, and they need to be sort of held back from racing too often because there's only so many races a year they can go really deep, or the stress of racing can just add up, and they start to almost lose the enjoyment of the whole process. And then you have other athletes who just thrive off racing. Yeah, so understanding, and then with those races those athletes that really need to race, they love it, it keeps them motivated. You still have to be, I think, cognizant that you don't want them to destroy their consistency in training. So I might make sure they're a bit tired going into the race. It's a training hit out, even if they don't want it to be one. So yeah, personality type plays a huge role with that. And then obviously, the prize money factor and bonuses and all that sort of thing for the pros is a hard one, because having been in the sport for a long time now and seeing what can happen when you just chase the prize money, the straight up prize money, especially now with some of the very lucrative races that are available, it's great and the money's good, but it's very short term. It's a nice big hit into your bank account. But if you can get an athlete to go top 5 in Kona, you're talking about sponsorship deals that can last for 5 or 6 years after that. And so trying to explain the bigger picture benefits of nailing a world championship is a part of that process, and trying to advise them around that.
That's an interesting question, especially in light of we're recording this just for context the day after the PTO Canadian Open, the Monday after the weekend of racing there. And do you see sponsorship contracts changing in the next couple of years so that they will weigh these PTO races as highly, or at least in the same ballpark as something like a Kona, which up until now has been like the main thing. 70.3 Worlds, of course, is also big, but nothing has been close to Kona as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I don't know. Watching, I'll be brutally honest, watching the PTO race, I love what they're trying to do. I still think we need to find a way to make it more entertaining. You can still have a long course style race, but I'd love to see it more on a lapped course and people getting lapped out. And, when I watch the Super League, if I had nothing to do with triathlon, I could imagine that I would still love to watch it. And I feel like we need to be a bit more brave with making the long course for those PTO races more creative. And I think and they're always changing, and I think they will. Like, I would love to see Collins Cup, a team relay, a bit like the Sub 7 project with country versus country, because I think it creates real interest. There's zero nationalistic. What am I saying? National pride for athletes, representing rest of the world as a category. Like, that doesn't get anyone excited or interested. So I feel like it's really close, and we're just so lucky to have that huge investment coming in. But I'd like to see some pretty brave decisions around making it more entertaining, and then 100%, I think it could drastically change the way sponsors view those races. If you're getting eyeballs on logos and it's creating great media interest, then it'll make a big difference. But at the moment, Kona still draws the most eyeballs, so sponsors really, really weight that the most heavily still.
Yeah. I guess it will be all about the eyeballs, really, because I don't think Kona is any more fun than the PTO Canadian Open was yesterday, even though they are the same format. But we'll see how the next couple of years pan out. I do agree that for the general person who is not like a super triathlon fan, then something probably needs to happen to make it a bit more entertaining still, considering it is a very long event. Yeah,
for sure. I think both Kona and the PTO races, is the hard part is getting more coverage without putting more motorbikes on the course, because anyone who's raced knows that it drastically changes the outcomes if you start getting motorbikes too close to races. And I'd love to see a tight course where you could just have heaps of drones up and actually be filming the battle going on between 6th and 8th place, in case there's nothing happening up front. Like, if there's nothing happening up front, you can flash to it occasionally, but we don't want to see that. Someone just solo time trialing for 4 hours, 2 hours. So I think, I think we've got to be a bit harsher with athletes, and if they get lapped out, they get lapped out. It's about the entertainment more than the athlete's self-esteem.
Going back to race selection, and one question on that as well is, how do you view strengths and weaknesses in terms of course profiles, environmental conditions, and so on? Does that play a really big part in how you would advise people to select their races?
Yeah, for sure. It also plays a big role into how you would train for a race. I think, I can use myself as an example, but Mont Tremblant in 2014, I looked at what the front swim group would be, and it was, Gomez was racing Frodeno, and I just thought, well, I'm not going to make this swim group. I'm going to have to really train my bike to another level to be able to ride up to them. As it turned out, I actually made the swim group, but then was so flustered and excited that I didn't put my wetsuit in the tub, and then lost the group because I had to go back and put it in. But I had the bike legs to sort of catch them by 60 kilometres. And then, of course, that came with the consequence of, not running particularly well, and I finished 7th. But I still think training for the bike for that race on a hilly course where I didn't think I'd make the group, it drastically changed the way I trained for the race. And then looking at, 2 years later at Sunshine Coast, I expected to make the group, and I knew it would be a bit of a pack ride. And so I actually trained differently. The run was super important, and I actually even raced, 3 kilos lighter just because I knew the run would be the crucial part of the race. So it plays a huge role from my own experience. I can, say to my athletes, the ones that are going to St. George this year, you got to be able to bike like a total machine on that course. There's no hiding. It's a tough race, and run strong more than, being more of an ITU prep where you just train your run to the highest level it can be. It plays a huge role. I think it is hard there are, the harsh reality as a coach. Sometimes you have to say to an athlete, this course isn't going to suit your strengths, and we don't have enough time to change those strengths. But it's the conversation that has to happen sometimes.
Yeah. What would you, what kind of tapering would you do for, and we're assuming here that this is a race that you're actually targeting, like a key race for you. What's your view on that?
I have to say that tapering as a coach is the thing that perplexes me the most. And I wish I had the right answer for, because as you've probably seen, you can do a taper approach for an athlete and they have the race of their life. You try the same taper next time and it doesn't work. Because there's so many factors with external stresses, with the travel, with how they're feeling, how much pressure they're putting on themselves, is the hotel they're staying at noisy? Like, there's just a lot to factor in. And so it's the one part of the program where I really say to the athlete, I'm happy to give you some control over this here. So, if I've scheduled some little maintenance intervals, race specific intervals in race week, and you're feeling exhausted or you haven't been sleeping well, I want you just to reduce it, by 50% or take it out altogether. It's the one part of coaching that really bothers me, because I always feel so nervous and unsure of what the best approach is on that taper based off so many factors that you can't control as a coach, or the athlete can't really control sometimes.
Yeah. What would you say if I say that I have the opinion that a lot of athletes do too much in the taper period, in the last 2 weeks before the race, even both in terms of volume and intensity, and partially for the reasons you mentioned there, with traveling and additional stress? You need to get your bike fixed and cleaned and packed and all of that. Like, there's a lot of things going on. You need to take time off work potentially if you're an age grouper or a part-time working pro. So yeah, that's kind of something that I'm looking at more often than not. If something goes wrong with it, I would say, basically, I think that it's more common that athletes do way too much in the taper period than that they don't do enough. That's kind of something that I think. Yeah,
so I think that I agree with you in that. I think they do way too much, particularly between 7 and 14 days out. I think a lot of athletes go into panic mode, and sometimes that's their biggest week of the prep, and then that they'll do the same. They'll tend to rest up pretty well from 5-6 days out, but they just forget that deep fatigue from doing a really stressful week 7 to 14. For a lot of athletes, you don't shake that out, because you're then traveling 5 days out. Your recovery from that week's compromised. I 100% agree with you. I think sometimes too little, 3 or 4, the last 4 days, to the point they're just eating, just loading up on carbs and getting sluggish and feeling like it's too big a change from what their body's used to. But then certainly, my typical approach, even for pros, would be the 7 to 14 days out, we might go from, if they're typical TSS, or I'll use hours, even though I don't like using hours. If they're typically 20 to 25 hours weeks, we'd normally do around 15 hours. 7 to 14 days out for a pro, and then 7 to 8 hours in race week would be certainly what worked for myself and a few other pros that I've worked with in terms of really freshening up for a race. So that would be the typical approach.
Yeah, that's very similar to what I would go with, kind of a 75 to 80% in that 7 to 14 days out week, and then 40 to 50%, this depends on if it's somebody doing 20 hours. Of course, if it's an age grouper doing 9 hours, you wouldn't go to 40% or potentially not even 50%. But for somebody doing a fair amount, I would go for something in that region as well.
Yep, great.
Regarding how to get the most out of yourself on race day and actually get a performance, what are some other things that you think are important to do? It could be anything really from a psychological perspective, or what did you find worked well for you as an athlete?
I think it's no secret that I was a very anxious racer, and the years where I got that under control, I had my best years. It combined with sort of the time of my life where I could train and rest as well as I could, but also was just in a good place mentally. And I think it's very cliche, but all of my best races would come after I was doing some meditation and mindfulness pretty much daily for sort of anywhere from 15 to 30 days going into a race, and then also doing some visualizations. The science is pretty amazing on it, actually, when you look at how the power of visualizations, and then also the way you can change your brain now. They're showing with daily meditation. I think athletes who aren't doing it, especially athletes who are like me, who get pretty highly strung and stressed out about race performance, I think that it's a given that it needs to be included at a minimum from the start of the taper, but ideally ongoing.
Yeah, that's really really good. What about in the race itself? Did you have any tips or tricks to help you through, or that you've seen work well for athletes you coach?
So it's just general tips for racing.
General. Well, let's to achieve your potential. Like, we're maybe not talking so much about. We will get to pacing next, so maybe more psychological and.
So I found even that visualization, or that that you would do pre-race, I would get athletes to visualize, okay, what are some likely scenarios? And I'm talking bad likely scenarios and good likely scenarios, and how will you mentally approach it? So what are you going to do when you get a flat tire? What's the response going to be? What are you going to do if you drop your bottle with all your concentrated calories in there? Getting people to actually think about it and have a little bit of a visualization and plan can totally change someone's race when it actually happens. And there's great to have your ideal scenario and visualize that. I think that's important. But then also working through what's the scenario when you miss the front group? How are we going to play the next 40 kilometers? What's the approach that you're going to take? And so that's a big part of what we work through, and the notes that I'll typically give someone, 4 or 5 days out, they need to think about these things and what their mindset will be. Mantras, I think, are really important. The mantra in itself is just a great way to, I think, stay neutral and keep your mindset neutral in a race. I'm not a big fan of athletes trying to stay positive throughout a race. I think it takes too much energy. I just think you got to dumb yourself down and try and just think about what you need to be doing right there and then. So it's sort of that, again, just being able to be in the moment is I think, one of the most performance enhancing things you can have on race day. As soon as you start, and I'm an emotional racer, and I think when I learned to control my emotions and not be angry, not be upset about what had happened in that race, or it's just like, what do I need to be doing right here, right now? They were certainly when I had my best races.
Yeah. So let's discuss pacing, which is another very big component, of course, of how you will do on race day. And this might be, let's discuss age groupers first. What tips would you give regarding pacing for age groupers?
Yeah, it's funny. I find there's not that much difference in the percentage of age groupers compared to pros who are good at pacing. I feel like there's just I don't know what the ratio would be, but some athletes are just great at pacing. You say, hey, I want you to go for this feeling, the first 5K of the run, feel like you have another gear, and they nail it. And then you say that to some athletes, age grouper or pro, and they still can't get it right. And they're the athletes. I might get, for an athlete who really hates wearing a watch, I might say, I don't want you breathing every time the right arm comes through for the first K. We might do breathing, every third step or that sort of thing. But for certain athletes, even one of my pros who's incapable of pacing correctly, I have to force him to wear a watch and just say, this is the number you're doing. Once you get to, I find once athletes are at, past 7, 8, 10 kilometers, they're sort of, their pacing ability starts to come to fruition. But before that, there's just sometimes there's a real inability to know what level of intensity they're at. And we've been doing more testing now, especially I've become fascinated with how poor athletes are at pacing the swim and looking at lactate levels at perceived efforts in the swim. So I want you to do, a zone 2, 800 meter, and then they get out and they're well into zone 3 when you look at the lactate. Or I want you to do an Ironman paced, 600 meters. And again, I'm finding people are just so often very close to anaerobic threshold. So I think almost educating people on and consistently showing them, no, you're not actually at the right intensity. You're going too hard. In the swim is the hard one because you don't have the number in front of you. So you really got to teach people what that feeling is that they're searching for. And then, for some people, it's just a matter of really being very specific with a watch and a heart rate limit or a pace limit for the first 5 to 8 kilometers.
Yeah. What about well, first of all, I just have to say on the swim and educating athletes about their actual levels and abilities. One good test for athletes that don't have access to lactate testing is to use a Finis tempo trainer and just set it to, let's say you have somebody preparing for an Ironman. Tell them to do I want to do a 3,800 meter continuous swim in the pool. You can use the tempo trainer, set it to a pace that will feel really easy for you at the start, and then go through it and just think about how it starts feeling after 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 and at the end of the swim. And in a lot of cases that you actually find that what felt really, really easy when you started starts feeling quite tough when you get to 3,000 meters especially and to the end, which just I think it shows also that the swim is a bit different in we don't necessarily have the same base endurance or aerobic capacity or metabolic development as in biking and running, but that's something that you need to know and be aware about when it comes to pacing the swim correctly, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating to me that so many athletes who are having issues on the bike and run, they're the athletes, when I do the testing in the swim, they're the athletes who mispace the swim the most. So I think, there's a lot to be said for learning, for really training your athletes in knowing what the right intensity is and being able to let the group go when necessary, or in age group ranks, especially in Ironman, 5 minutes lost in the swim could equal 20 minutes quicker on the run for some people. Absolutely. Yeah.
What about the bike, pacing on the bike and for age groupers still, is that, what would you typically say to them? Would you be a bit conservative with bike pacing or, any general tips there?
Yeah, I think it depends on the distance, obviously, and on the athlete and what their strengths are. But it's much easier to get people to pace correctly on the bike because they've got so many metrics in front of them. So, it's the hard part is the hard part about the bike is everyone knows how much advantage there is with the groups, even 12 meters apart, 10 meters apart, whatever they are. So it's sometimes an athlete has to make a decision. Do I push hard for 5 kilometers to catch that group up ahead, and then legally ride with the massive assistance of that group, which is something why I've always argued it needs to be closer to 15 to 20 meters, 20 meter gaps to make it fair. So typically, if you look at the pacing, it's not that complicated in a triathlon. It's Craig Alexander used to always use the expression, you've got 3 cups and you got one jug of water. If you want the 3 cups to be pretty equal, you just got to spread the water out equally and not fill one cup too much, because then the other two are going to suffer.
Yeah. What about on the pro side? That's where race dynamics, of course, start to play a huge role. And especially if you want to win the race or be on the podium, you will probably have to take some risks, unless you're really the best in the world. But most athletes will have to take some risks. But at the same time, a lot of athletes ruin their races by taking too many risks, and that it blows up in their faces. So what would you suggest there?
I think it's the biggest misunderstanding from age groupers who look at who are racing pros. Sometimes an age grouper will be right up there with the pro race, and I really have to argue it's such a different dynamic. And like you said, there's certain points in a race which can sensible pacing sort of has to go out the window, because it's you might have there's a lot of other factors to take in. One of the biggest ones is what the media are doing. If there's media with motorbikes and you're suddenly the front 3 guys with a motorbike filming diagonally next to them, suddenly the guys that are there are getting 1.5, 2 kilometers per hour advantage. And if you've suddenly got to get to that position, it's just the nature of pro racing is there's a lot more dynamics. And I'm sure even in the Tour de France, which I'm sure you've been glued to it as well, that would be a huge part of all their tactics is they know when to attack. If the motorbike gets too close, you suddenly see them shoot off out of the peloton. So that's a part, but also just I think staying with certain athletes, knowing that there's the advantage there with being with the group. It's a lot more complicated than just let's just go for the best evenly paced swim bike run that I can. It's funnily enough for a lot of athletes, I still think in Ironman, even in the pros, that would probably pay off in many cases to the fastest time they could do. And certainly my own, I haven't done many Ironmans well, but the ones that I did do well, I literally went in with that approach and just stuck to my numbers and ignored everyone else. But for 70.3s, that certainly never worked out for me. I had to really race the race. So it's a different dynamic the shorter you go, I think.
Yeah, and probably also depending on what your goal is. So when you are fighting for World Championship titles, for example, you have to take a lot of risks. But maybe at this point in your career, it might sometimes be beneficial to be a bit more, stick to your own plan and not get too involved with what's going on.
I think so. And also when you get older, your ability to do that real top end surges and bounce back, it does start to wane a little bit, but you're at the same time, I feel like your aerobic efficiency and endurance, like certainly for myself, I don't feel like that's dropped off at all. It's just that top end revs are not the same as they used to be, although I'm starting to try to work on that a lot more now.
So how do people and pro athletes or aspiring pro athletes improve this aspect of pacing and race dynamics? Is it just about racing and learning, failing a few times and getting up again and learning from those experiences, or are there any? Or is it thinking through different race scenarios in advance, as you discussed before with the visualization? Are there any other things they can do?
I think knowing your limits and how long you can do that. So we might have a strategy of, okay, we can do up to this much time at threshold or above, threshold, and then you go with that group for this. But if it's more than 10 minutes and the pace hasn't dropped back into a reasonable zone, you're not going to be able to run well, so we let them go. I think I think that would be a big part of it. And then I had another thought, but I'll leave it there for that. I think that's probably the biggest thing is setting up some limitations and guidelines around the pacing to know, okay, that's where you can go to and where you can't. But also specificity plays a huge role. So, whereas an age grouper, we might do their specific Ironman sets might be, we're doing 4 times 30 minutes at Ironman power. For a pro, it could be 4 times 30 with if it's for Kona with a spike up, every 10th minute you do a minute at closer to threshold, closer to FTP or even above, to simulate what it's going to be like on that rolling terrain with the Constantine effect and having to stay out of draft zones and then surge back up. And so that teaching the body to just be specific with what the actual requirements will be is a big part of I think preparing properly.
Yeah, and the final question on racing is race scheduling in terms of how many races to do in a season, how many races you can do and still recover well and perform. And again, this is probably a question that is you can tackle from both the age group side and the pro side, because they are probably going to be quite different answers.
Yeah, in some ways, yes, but in many ways, a lot of the pros are actually working nearly as much as age groupers and balancing a lot of things, contrary to what everyone thinks. So I think for age groupers, the biggest factor is with how much racing and how intense they can take it is how much can their family tolerate. So it's about how do we keep you in the sport and from everyone else burning out and getting a bit fed up with it. So that's a big factor. I think, obviously how much their work, when you're in the middle of an Ironman block, there's no way other things in your life don't suffer a little bit as much as you try not to. So, how much can their work tolerate a little bit of a drop off on that side of things. So there's a lot of factors, I guess, just around the person's life and the external things that matter as well. And I feel like as a coach, I spend a lot of my time convincing athletes to race less, not more. certainly on the longer races, and even convincing athletes that hey, there's this sort of perception that short course is for some reason less of a challenge, less of a triathlon. I'm really working hard to try and change that perception with my athletes. And hey, you can. It'll actually help your Ironman career long term if you can keep racing and stay motivated. And we spend some time throughout the year working on short course races. And then for pros, I think race selection is a hard one because the finances is a huge factor, and what's going to be the best for setting, making money and making sure you're not going backwards, as well as, it's a balance between peaking for the key races, but still having enough money from doing some of the other races to be able to get to the key races. So I'd say for most pros, apart from the top 5, 5, 10, 15, maybe, money is a huge factor, and balancing, chasing prize money over nailing the key races. And then for age groupers, I think the biggest factors are family, work, and work.
Right. Yeah. Just a couple of other questions before, and then the rapid fire question. So one question that I want to ask you, just as a coach, is there anything in particular that you're focused on right now as part of your own coaching, something that you're particularly interested in, or doing some research in, or like that, something like that?
Yeah, I think my main interest now is trying to get more face-to-face time with my athletes to do more lactate testing, finding out specifically what we need to work on. That's the downside of online coaching, is I feel like I want to get more time with athletes, basically. Even whenever we run camps, it's sometimes you just pick up some basic things like, wow, your bike position's horrible, or that swim technique, we can fix this. So the challenge for me is, trying to find ways to do more face-to-face coaching. I'd say that's the biggest, my challenge, but also the thing that I'm trying to work on the most with is getting around and spending more time with athletes. Yeah.
And if you could give 3 pieces of advice for listeners of the podcast, anything that could help them improve their triathlon performance, what would that be?
Now we're running in. Okay. So I think giving the coach time and having some trust that it could work. You would have seen it too. You go through the process of getting an athlete started and they're not getting results in straight away, and they're frustrated. So time, committing. If you're going to commit to a coach, give them the amount of time that's needed to see the changes and fully commit. Otherwise, don't go with them in the first place. 3 pieces that I think on a nutrition perspective, there's so much conflicting advice out there that my general rule of thumb is, if it's taken a lot of human intervention to make the food edible, then it's probably not that healthy. So outside of training, just eat real food. And, I'm not a big fan of diets or, eat when you're hungry, stop when you're not, wait till you're really hungry again. Third piece of advice is learn to take time off. I think we lose perspective on how much we train as triathletes and how intense it is. I look now at what would be a taper week, and in my first few years in triathlon, that would have been a massive week for me. And so it's learning to really let the body bounce back, especially when you start doing a lot of blood tests on athletes. You see the toll that is taken on the athlete when they get towards the end of an Ironman prep, and how important, how important taking a month off, 6 weeks off is to really let the body come back. That would be my quick 3 pieces of advice.
Yeah, awesome. And finally, the rapid fire question. So take just one sentence to answer each of these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to triathlon or endurance sports?
I really like Andy Coggin's Training and Racing with Power. I think I bought it when I first got I think he might have had an edition out pretty early on when I first got my power meter. But yeah, it's just, I like the approach, and it's always seemed to work pretty well with using his principles with improving athletes' cycling.
Yeah. And what's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
I think as a outside triathlon, I'm pretty poor at planning. And I found that the better I got at planning with training and racing and even travel, the better my racing went. And, I'd say putting the time in to plan properly. And I learned to really enjoy the process even more than the racing. And I think a lot of that was about having a plan and ticking off the steps. Just having a big goal without a plan just gets it overwhelming and can be a bit disappointing, but having the step-by-step plan is what's exciting for me. And it definitely paid off. And when things get too chaotic and all the planning goes out the window, everything suffers.
And who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
There's probably 2 people. I think my wife's very inspiring. The amount of things she gets through each day. She's a doctor and quite well respected in where we live, and just not financially motivated at all. She does a lot of good social things, for the way she operates. And then Craig Alexander as an athlete was just a lot of the pros I grew up looking up to. He sort of, I think, more even as he stepped away and slowly stepped away from being fully focused athlete, I think I grew my respect for him grew even further, because he just showed he's a good human, and was able to actually step back at the right time and put it back into his family. And I just got a lot of respect for that. I think it changes depending on what stage of life you're at, but he inspired me to, for someone to be at the top of the sport, and there's no doubt you've got to be very self-absorbed. I wouldn't say selfish, because you're making a lot of money for your family at the time, but then knowing when to step back, it'd be very hard. And I think he, was able to do that in a good way.
Yeah. And finally, where can people find you, follow you, learn more about your coaching and everything that you got going on?
Yeah, well, we've got our website is rpgcoaching.com. My personal website, timreid.com.au. You can follow us on Instagram. That's where we sort of do most of our athlete updates. But yeah, it's that's basically where we're at. Where I try and be active is more on Clint, my coaching partner, and I. We do most of our updates go onto social media, so you can follow us on there.
Yeah, I'll put the links in the show notes. And thank you so much, Tim, for taking the time. It was great to have a chat, and I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm sure the listeners will as well.
Thank you. It was great to chat.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes and all the relevant links on scientifictriathlon.com. And remember, as I mentioned at the start of this episode, the new training plan, the advanced sprint distance training plan. Find out all the details on scientifictriathlon.com/plans. And remember that you can get a 60% discount until the 14th of August. So only this week to take advantage of that. And remember our training camps, Mallorca and the Algarve in 2023 in March and January respectively. Again, go to scientifictriathlon.com to read about them and register if you're interested, or email me if you have any questions. Next Monday, I interview Dr. Christian Chung on the topic of CBD for endurance athletes. These products are getting more and more popular, and we'll discuss what the state of the evidence is regarding the use of CBD, but also the associated risks, which are primarily anti-doping related. And that is a very important risk to consider whether you are a professional or an amateur. So definitely an episode worth listening to. And finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free fuel and hydration planner to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs, and get a specific and effective race strategy, and book a free video consultation if you want to refine that strategy further. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of their products. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses. And use the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS for 20% off your entire Roka order. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.